Dr. Charlene Senegal DeQueer is Associate Professor of History at Xavier University, a native Louisianian. She went to college at Xavier and later went to LSU. And she's going to talk about her topic is called The Struggle Was Real, the 1960s New Orleans Civil Rights Movement. So welcome, Dr. Senegal.
Thank you guys so much for having me. Can you guys all hear me and see the screen?
Yes, we can.
Thumbs up. Great. Okay, well, I'm going to just go ahead and jump on in. So over 60 years ago, the African-American community in New Orleans embarked on a path that many in the United States were on. It was a path to end Jim Crow. But for the citizens of New Orleans, this fight was one that they had been battling since Louisiana had enacted the Separate Car Act in 1890, which led to the 1896 landmark decision in the Supreme Court case of Plessy versus Ferguson. The decision in that case created legal segregation and the doctrine of separate but equal accommodations throughout the United States. From that moment, the 14th Amendment rights of African American citizens was shattered for 58 years until the law was overturned in 1954 with the Brown decision, Brown versus Board of Education. The Brown decision declared that separate but equal accommodations was unconstitutional and a violation of the 14th Amendment. So now the real struggle began. And the question for Blacks, the question of Black civil rights organizations across America was, how do we work to enforce the laws of integration and equality? After years of waiting and hoping that something would change, a direct action approach was taken. It was boots on the ground, visibility, picketing, sit-ins, boycotts, rallies. That's the approach that that the civil rights movement decided to take. In New Orleans, the people who led that direct action approach were predominantly our youth and also majority women. So this presentation is going to be an overview of their stories. It's kind of a two-part approach focusing on the activism of the New Orleans core chapter and also women activists. So New Orleans, of course, as we just saw in that wonderful lecture, was one of the better known cities in the state of Louisiana because of tourism. In the 60s, 40%, almost 40% of New Orleans population was African American. New Orleans had a very strong, united Black leadership class that was not afraid to implement direct action tactics as a means to end Jim Crow. In late 1959, the Black leadership organized the Consumer League of Greater New Orleans, an all-Black organization to fight employment discrimination. The Consumer League provided the youth with their initial experience of direct action protest in New Orleans. And it was done so by boycotting the Dryage Street stores. Dryage Street, and this is a picture here of the boycotts on Dryage Street. Dryage Street was like the Black Canal Street of New Orleans. It's where most Black people shopped because they could go into the shops and actually try on the clothing and that kinds of stuff. So they got attention or the shopping experience that they would not have gotten on Canal Street. So a lot of Black people shopped on Dryage Street. Now, the main concern with Dryage Street was that although Black dollars were spent there, there were not Black people working in positions of like sales clerk and so on. You did have Black people working there, but there were menial positions like janitors and so on. And so what the Consumer League wanted to do was they wanted to make sure that Black dollars were not going to be spent in places where Black people were not employed. And so they enacted this direct action approach. And so the boycott was actually scheduled a week before Easter, and that was done strategically because that was the busiest time for the shopping season on Dryage Street. And so the shoppers were actually replaced by student protesters from all of the universities, including Xavier University, Dillard University, Southern University of New Orleans, Tulane, and also LSUNO, which is UNO later on. So with the help of all of these youth and the guidance of the Consumer League, they claimed credit for creating 30 new jobs on Dryage Street as because of these boycotts. So after the Dryad Street boycotts, the students decided that they wanted to keep the momentum. And so what they decided to do was to form a chapter of CORE in New Orleans. And the chapter of CORE in New Orleans was formed in the summer of 1960. And if you look at the slide right here, we have three of the influential members of CORE. We have Aratha Castle Haley, and she actually served as the second president of CORE from 1961 to 1964. She was a co-founder with Rudy Lombard. Rudy Lombard was the first president of the New Orleans CORE, who later went on to serve as the national vice president of the entire organization. He also was a Xavier University senior class president. And then we have Jerome Smith. Jerome Smith was a former student of Southern University, Baton Rouge, who was actually expelled after the Baton Rouge protests downtown, but he was also a co-founder and later went on to participate in the second wave of the Freedom Rides, one from Montgomery to, I think it was Montgomery to Jackson, and then one also in Macomb, Mississippi. Mm-hmm. So on November 9th, 1960, we had five students, 5 Blacks, 2 whites, and they are going to stage the first sit-in in New Orleans at a Woolworth's lunch counter on Canal Street. They were all arrested, but their actions inspired the Black community of New Orleans to support CORE's efforts. 3 days later, New Orleans Mayor Morrison, he issued a statement banning picketing and sit-ins in the city. The city increased police control at the request of the mayor, resulting in the arrest of any demonstrators, whether they were sitting in at a lunch counter, whether they were picketing, or even if they were just handing out leaflets. So 4 days after that, on September 16th, CORE's field secretary came to town. His name was James McCain. He, along with Reverend Alexander from the Consumer League and a few other members, they were all arrested for picketing stores on Claiborne Avenue. The following day, on September 17th, in defiance of the mayor's order again, Rudy Lombard, who was the president at the time, and 3 CORE members, including Aretha Castle Haley, Cicely Carter, and Stanley Laney Goldfinch, were arrested for staging a sitting at the McCurry's lunch counter on Canal Street. Lombard, Castle, Carter, Goldfinch, they were all charged with and convicted of violating Louisiana's criminal mischief statute, and it was basically a statute saying that they were disturbing the peace, but they actually were not disturbing the peace at all. So the CORE members and their attorneys, of course, appealed the conviction in 1961, and that case was State versus Goldfinch. But the Louisiana Supreme Court maintained the verdict of the lower court, and the CORE members and their attorneys continued to press on until the case made it all the way to the United States Supreme Court in 1962. And at that point, the case was renamed Lombard versus Louisiana. So on May 20th, 1963, the United States Supreme Court reversed the convictions of those 4 CORE members. And this was actually, again, like I said, 3 years after the case actually started, but they reversed that. So that was really a good thing. And here we have a picture of the September 9th sit-ins at the Woolworth's lunch counter. Okay, and here we have a picture. This is a 2010 picture of Sidney Goldfinch over on the left side, and then Jerome Smith is in the middle, and then the Aratha Smith Simmons, who we'll talk about later, is on the end. Sidney Goldfinch he passed away in 2017, but he was very influential, Tulane student, again, one of the named plaintiffs in that case that I just mentioned. So the sit-ins in New Orleans, I would like to say that they were actually quite unusual because the sit-ins in New Orleans were really, really lengthy. If you think about the Greensburg sit-ins that happened, after 5 months, you had lunch counters that started, the Woolworth's lunch counter desegregated, and then other cities actually acted fast. They acted quicker than New Orleans, but not in New Orleans. So New Orleans actually opted to continue segregation for 2 more years. And during that time, you had a group of young, determined protesters from CORE, and they were joined by the NAACP Youth Council, which I'll mention in just a second. They took buses, like city buses, over to that part of Canal Street every day for 2 years, and they picketed, they boycotted, and they sat in for 2 years until these lunch counters actually did integrate. And I have a quote from Rudy Lombard. He actually said that the group was prepared to do the sit-ins for as long as it took. And here's the quote. He said, "Until it stopped or we died," end quote. So this was definitely something that they were 100% in, and they wanted to make sure that the outcome was going to be an integrated lunch counter. So of course, this is not going to be the end of CORE. I'm going to pick up with CORE in just a second, but I know you're probably wondering, well, what's going on with the NAACP in New Orleans? So New Orleans, they did have an NAACP. The New Orleans branch NAACP had struggled with leadership, with its leadership approach from time to time. It was actually chartered in 1915, but from 1915 through 1940, the organization struggled. So throughout those years, the leadership of the New Orleans branch was very cautious. They carefully adopted national programs that they saw that fit in safe perimeters of their moderate approach, because they were a very moderate organization in New Orleans. And so this actually, like I said, caused the New Orleans branch to experience uncertainties in their capabilities to perform as a protest organization. So their lack of aggression caused disharmony between the national NAACP office and the New Orleans branch NAACP office. And so the organization, the NAACP, actually went dormant a couple of times in New Orleans. They went dormant from 1919 to 1924, and then again from 1937 to 1940. But by the 50s, there was new leadership, the new leadership that had taken over with the presidency of Arthur Chapman. And he was president from 1952 to 1962, and then followed by Ernest Dutch Morial, who became president in 1963 to 1965. But under Chapman's leadership, that's when the New Orleans branch NAACP started a youth council. And the youth council, as we see here, Dr. Raphael Cashmere is going to be one of the presidents of the NAACP Youth Council. And I served with him on a couple panels and have talked to him about his experience in the youth council. And I asked him how he got involved, and he said, actually, I went to a meeting one day and I just got caught up. And he said, eventually I became the president. I don't even know how it happened. But he said for a while in the organization, they had a lot of members, and everything that they were doing was a lot of talk. It was talk, and talking about what CORE was doing and how great CORE was. They were performing direct action, and how the NAACP Youth Council wanted to be a part of that. But the advisors of the youth council kept holding them back, saying, no, we don't want to get involved in that. And what happened was that the youth council said, forget about you old guys, we're going to go ahead and help out our brothers and sisters in CORE. And that's what they did. And so they actually joined in with CORE against the advice of their advisors, and they began to help out with the picketing and the sit-ins and the boycotts of those restaurants and different things on Canal Street. So he said, and here's a quote that I got from him. He said, everyone came to Canal Street to shop, everyone. And he said, we thought it would have been easy, but it wasn't. It took 2 years. And just a little bit of backstory behind Dr. Cashmere. He in 1967 became the first African-American teaching assistant at UNO. And then in 1969, he was the first African-American instructor hired at the university. He remained at UNO for 35 years, rising in ranks all the way to professor, and he retired in 2007. And so Dr. Cashmere, he serves on different panels and different things like that, and he talks about his experience, but it's a really great story. So if you ever have a chance to talk to him, please pick his brain. He's amazing. So moving on, we're gonna go switch over to CORE and what is happening with the Freedom Rides. So, of course, the sitting movements are going to pave the way for the freedom rides of 61. And so CORE's founders, James Farmer and Barnum Rustin, they decided that it was time to restart their 1947 mission to have a group of Black and white people ride interstate buses and trains together throughout the South. So the Freedom Rides of 61 test the compliance of two Supreme Court cases that barred whites from abusing Blacks on interstate travel. In those two cases, Morgan versus Virginia in 1946, and then another one, Boynton versus Virginia in 1960. The riders began a two-week journey of 1,500 miles from DC, as you can see on the map, all the way at the top. And their mission was to make it all the way to New Orleans by May 17th, the anniversary of the Brown decision. And of course, most of us are familiar with the story of the Freedom Rides, but did you know that Xavier University played a role in that history? And so if you look on the map, there's the Xavier symbol going into New Orleans right there, right? So in my research and interviewing with Dr. Francis, who was the president of Xavier for 46 years, I interviewed him and I asked him about the experiences of the Freedom Ride. And the story that he told me was quite interesting. He said that one day Rudy Lombard had come into his office. And remember, Rudy Lombard was the president of the New Orleans French Corps for a year, and then later on becomes the vice president of the entire Corps organization, right? So he comes into Dr. Francis's office, and Dr. Francis was Dean of Men at the time. And he told him all about the Nationals office plan to have this Freedom Ride. And, you know, the 13 students are going to go in and they're going to test all these cases, and they're going to sit together and use white only restrooms and lunch counters and so on. And so after Rudy finished the story, Dr. Francis said, and he responded, and I quote, "I don't think they're going to make it to New Orleans," end quote. Unfortunately, Dr. Francis' prediction actually came true, and the bus of Freedom Riders did not make it to New Orleans. The bus of riders fell under attack in Alabama, and they could not continue their journey on to New Orleans as planned. So Rudy Lombard actually received a call, and the call was stating that the riders were going to be coming to New Orleans 3 days ahead of schedule, and they were wondering if he could find shelter for those riders. So he had gone, you know, he went back to Dr. Francis in the office, and they had this conversation, and he asked Dr. Francis, can they stay at St. Mike's dormitory? And of course, Dr. Francis was like thinking about it for a little while. And he went on to ask the president of the university at the time, who was a sister of the Blessed Sacrament, President Josephina Kinney. And President Josephina Kinney said, well, it's your decision. And so Dr. Francis actually made that decision to go ahead and harbor the students over the Freedom Riders over at St. Joe's. So on 14 Freedom Riders arrived in New Orleans on May 14th, 1961, 3 days prior to their scheduled arrival. They were met at the New Orleans airport by members of the New Orleans Corps, and they were taken to Xavier. And Dr. Francis recalled, he said, when they got there, when they got out of the car, they were all bloody, they were all beaten. And Xavier University immediately began receiving threats by the white community of New Orleans, although no one followed through. And it's possible that they didn't follow through because of Xavier's Catholic connection. And, you know, New Orleans is a Catholic city, so maybe that has something to do with it. But still, within hours of the riders arriving, the White Citizens Councils in New Orleans petitioned Mayor Morrison to kick the Freedom Riders out of town. And despite all of this hostility and the increasing hostility, bomb threats and whatnot, Dr. Francis stood his ground, and he allowed these Freedom Riders to stay in St. Mike's dormitory. And so here's a picture of St. Mike's, and here's a picture on the left of one of the Freedom Riders as he was talking to one of the reporters from the Black Press about the incidents that happened in Alabama. Mm-hmm. All right, so the story continues because after that part of the Freedom Rides, many people thought that the Freedom Rides would have been over, right? But of course, we know the history and the story with Diane Nash and SNCC, Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, and how she organized more people to continue on the Freedom Rides. And so that's exactly what happened. So now with the continuations of the Freedom Rides, we see that the core members of New Orleans are going to become very active in these new Freedom Rides. And so the second wave of Freedom Riders, they are going to leave New Orleans, and it's 21 of them. They're going to leave on May 20th, and they're going to arrive in Montgomery, Alabama. They were greeted by a white mob, and they were beaten. And then at that point, the federal government became involved. On May 24th, 27 Freedom Riders continued on the journey from Montgomery to Mississippi. And the National Guard, of course, protected the buses until they arrived in Jackson. But when they arrived in Jackson, as soon as they got off of the bus, they were all arrested and sent to the Mississippi State Penitentiary. And so these are some of the core members right here who were actually arrested on that second wave of the Freedom Rides. So to the left, we have Doris Jean, who was a sister of Aretha Castle. She was 18 at the time. So all of these people were teenagers. She was 18. And then we have Shirley Thomas, who was also 18. Next to her is George Raymond. He was 18 years old. He also became a field director for Corps in Mississippi later on. And then we have a picture of Jean Thomas, and she was 19. And so here's a story about, Shirley, Jean, and there was another sister, Alice. All three of them were very influential in Corps, and they were just known as the Thomas sisters. And I have a story or interview from Jean Thomas. And in this picture, she was 19 years old. Like I said, she was about 94 pounds. And in an interview for the Freedom Riders Project, she said, when something happened, you have to make a stand. She also said that stand that her and her sisters made eventually cost her father his job. He was a longshoreman, and he was fired because of the work that they were doing in the New Orleans Corps. But she said that her parents always encouraged her and her sisters that they were doing the right thing. So that made it all better, or not all better, but that made it all worth it. So she and her two sisters, they were influential, very influential in everything. They were always together, and they were just known, again, like I said, as the Thompson sisters. All right. Okay, so next we have another Freedom Ride that happened in McComb, Mississippi. And this Freedom Ride in McComb, Mississippi, we have some of the New Orleans Corps members. We have DeRotha over here to the left, and then we have Jerome Smith, Alice Thomas, George Raymond, and then Julia Aaron. This photograph was taken right after they had gotten beaten by a mob in McComb, Mississippi for trying to integrate the bus station there. And I have quotes of interviews of actual accounts of what happened. So DeRotha, who's also known as Dodie Smith, she said in an interview that one Corps member, Jerome Smith, was beaten with brass knuckles. Another, George Raymond Jr., had hot coffee poured over his head, and others were beaten and chased, and she and Alice were kicked. She said the team eventually got separated during the frenzy and the beatings, and she remembers being chased by a group of white men, but somehow she made it to the Black side of the terminal where she found refuge. And she said the Black people just encircled her, and she thought to herself, okay, gain your composure and walk out of here. And so she walked out, and she said as soon as she walked out, she ran for her life. And eventually, someone found her along the way, and they returned her to the Black-owned White Castle Hotel where they were staying, and that's where she received medical treatment. And she was told to call Bobby Kennedy, and when she called Bobby Kennedy, he said, I know what's going on, and I'm sending protection for you guys. And DeRotha said she actually declined the protection because they were there to do a job, and she was going to do it. And then the account of Jerome Smith was, he says, when we entered the McComb bus station, all these white folks came pouring in shouting racial epithets, and they were beating us with brass knuckles, with fists, with sticks. He said he was being overwhelmed by some of these mobs, the mob folks, and that his friend George Raymond stepped in and pretty much saved his life, that he enabled him to remove himself from the danger zone, and George Raymond actually took on a lot of the beatings. And then they eventually made their way out of that bus station and into the streets. And just then, he said, a man came with a dirty old truck and saved them. And so this older man, he described him as an Uncle Tom man. And he had so the white people in the area knew him. And so this white man said, get in the back of the truck. And in the back of the truck, they had like pig's feed, and it was dirty and all that. And they hid underneath all of that and made it safely out of the danger zone and back to the hotel. But this is just to say that, you know, the New Orleans movement and the people of CORE, it wasn't just New Orleans, but they were doing things throughout the state, and also, you know, in Mississippi and so on, to try and end Jim Crow. In Baton Rouge, they had a huge movement. Later on, we'll see with the Freedom Summers and the voter registrations in Plaquemine Parish, we have CORE members that go there and they try to get people registered to vote. And so New Orleans, the people of New Orleans, they were the ones who were really instigating and keeping the movement alive throughout the state, actually. All right, so now I'm gonna kind of switch gears a little bit, because I would be remiss if I didn't speak about the contributions of the women of the movement in New Orleans. A few years ago, I hosted a panel at Xavier University focusing on children and youth activism in Louisiana civil rights movement. And the panel included, I would say, the all-stars: Leona Tate, Dorotha Doty Smith, who's pictured right here, Kenneth Ferdinand, and Drs. Rafia Kashmir and Warren Ray. At the forum, Dorotha, she's simply known as Doty by all of the civil rights activists of the 60s and the movement in New Orleans. She made a powerful observation of the movement that had all of the male participants on the panel shaking their head, like, yeah. And this is what she said. She said, "Women were the backbone of the civil rights movement. Had it not been for the women, men would have given up at the first unsuccessful attempt to end Jim Crow." End quote. So according to Doty, it was the women who showed the men how to be strong, how to persevere, how to demand equality in a system of oppression, especially in New Orleans. Her revelation about the significance of women as leaders in the movement is one that has been considered, but not published about in the larger scope of the civil rights movement until around the 90s, with the publication of Women in the Civil Rights Movement, Trailblazers and Torchbearers. And since then, Shannon Feinstein, she wrote a book in 2009 titled Our Minds on Freedom: Women in the Struggle for Black Equality in Louisiana. And then we've also had a few other people: Kim Lacey Rogers, Pam Tyler, Greta Dijon. They have also been writing about women in the movement, and especially in Louisiana. So there are several women who courageously fought for the civil rights movement in New Orleans through various avenues that provoked this change in the community. It challenged inequality and ultimately paved the way for New Orleans to have its first female, African-American female mayor, LaToya Cantrell, right? So first, I want to start out by talking about some personal testimony from the one and only Sybil Morial. So I did a paper a couple of years ago for Louisiana Historic Association, and I found this great interview. It was a symposium that was held in 2002 at Southern University, New Orleans, called Louisiana Women in Civil Rights Era: From Memory to Education. And I watched this and analyzed it and took a couple different stories out of what was going on. And so Sybil's story is one that actually stood out to me in this whole presentation. And so she said she recalled a 1960 conversation that she had with a friend of hers who was African-American mother in her late 20s and early 30s. And she said, she'd asked the lady, she said, "Well, who are you going to vote for in the next election?" And the lady said, "Well, I don't know. I have to ask my husband." And Sybil said, and I quote, she thought to herself, "We can't be that ignorant," end quote. Because Sybil understood the importance of the political process, and she firmly believed that women should not depend on their husbands to make political decisions that will impact the lives of their children. So she immediately contacted Rosa Keller of New Orleans, who was the Coca-Cola heiress. And Rosa Keller was a member of the League of Women Voters in New Orleans, which was a segregated organization that had began in 1942. So Sybil asked Rosa, "Do you think that we could integrate this organization, because I have women who need to know about the political process?" And Rosa thought, "Oh, sure, it's not going to be a problem." But when she went back to the League and she asked them, it actually was a problem, and the League did not integrate until 1963. But in the meantime, Sybil took it upon herself to organize the Louisiana League of Good Government. And so the Louisiana League of Good Government so that she and her friends could gain knowledge about the political process and the workings of government, as well as make change in the community by getting other Black people informed and registered to vote. Sybil noted that the most important work that the League did was in the community, that the League actually targeted 3 African American neighborhoods in which they taught the complicated voter registration process, that including passing a citizenship test, a literacy test, and an age test, in which a person had to figure out their age in years, months, and days of their birth. She recalled that at the age of 21, she had gone down to take the voter registration test, and the register told her that her test was not correct because she had wrote that her eyes were brown, and the register said that her eyes were Black. After much discussion, Sybil firmly told the register, well, I've been looking at my eyes for all my life, and I think I know that they are brown. And so the register backed off. But the leadership role that Sybil took within her community as a community organizer and as a teacher is one that defied the traditional gender roles of the time, which was largely limited to domestic roles for women. Her activism didn't stop there. In 1962, she became a plaintiff in the lawsuit against the state of Louisiana, successfully challenging a state statute prohibiting public school teachers from getting involved in any organization advocating civil rights and integration. At the time, Sybil was a member of both the Urban League and the NAACP. She risked losing her job as a teacher to challenge this law, but she strongly felt that the law needed to be challenged and that she was the right person to do so. In 2015, Sybil published her memoirs, which you see right here, Witness to Change: From Jim Crow to Public Empowerment, cementing her role in the narrative of New Orleans civil rights movement as a socially conscious leader and an engaged activist. In the 1960s New Orleans school crisis is one that serves as a forefront for the battle against racial segregation. And I think we are all we all know a little bit about what happened with the New Orleans school segregation cases. But again, so 1954, we have Brown versus Board of Education case, separate but equal cause is unconstitutional. In 1956, Judge Skelly Wright of the Federal District Court in New Orleans, he is going to order that the Orleans Parish School Board implement a constructive plan for integration. And so his plan, Judge Wright's plan, actually sought to integrate the school a grade a year from the bottom up, so beginning at the lower grades, the first grade. However, due to opposition, it took 4 years for New Orleans to actually implement that ruling. And here's a picture of some of the protests that was going on to begin the student integration of schools. So a lot of people, again, like I said, we all know the story. Most of us know the story of Ruby Bridges. And the reason why we know the story so much is because of the famous Norman Rockwell painting. Ruby Bridges was 6 years old when she became, as most people think, the first person, the first African-American student to integrate an elementary school in the South, but she actually was not the only person doing that at that time. There were actually 3 others doing it at the exact time. On November 14, 1960, it was Ruby Bridges, it was Gail Etienne, it was Leona Tate, and Tessie Provost. They all integrated elementary schools at the same time. And so the McDonough 3, they integrated McDonough 19. And their story is not, one that is widely known or widely told, but on that panel that I had, and I'm going to switch aside, on the panel that I had a couple of years ago at Xavier, we had Leona Tate, and I interviewed Leona Tate, and I asked her if she knew what she was doing at that time, that she was integrating McDonough 19. And she actually said that she had no idea, as a 6-year-old, she had no idea of the impact or what she was actually doing, but that it was her, she credited her mother as being the true unsung hero of her story. She said she remembered that her mother telling her that she had to set a good example and that everybody would be watching her. And she said her mom firmly believed that no door should be closed to her because of the color of her skin. And it was her mom that ultimately made the decision that she was going to integrate McDonough 19. She ended the interview by saying, "My mom was courageous. She fight like a bull. She was brave," end quote. So again, Leona's statement about her mom continues to prove the commitment and the strength of African-American women in the fight to end Jim Crow. And so here we have a picture of the three little girls. They were 6 years old: Leona Tate, Gail Etienne, and Tessie Purvills, and then one in 1981 when they went back and visited McDonough 19. The next woman I want to talk about is Virginia Collins. She participated in the 2002 forum at Southern University of New Orleans also. She was a mother of 10 in 1960. She worked outside of the home, and she still found time to be an active leader in the movement. As a leader in the movement, she recalled being an organizer and a teacher of nonviolent tactics to student activists who participated in the sit-ins and the pickets. And she said it was hard, but she arranged her schedule to make time for her family to be involved in the movement. She said she joined everything, all of the congresses, all of the associations, anything that grouped Black people together for social and political change. So she held a leadership role as president of her children's PTA and also vice president of the Confederation of Parent Teacher Association. She balanced her gender roles of being a wife and a mother with being an active participant in and leader in the movement because she involved her children in the pickets and sit-ins. And she said her and her children went to jail together on several occasions, but she said it was okay because she was teaching her children to stand up for what they believed in, just as her parents had taught her, because her parents were actually Garveyites. So Virginia went on to state that there was more active participation by African-American women in New Orleans, in the New Orleans movement. And she felt that the reason was because African-American women were more sympathetic to gaining equal rights. She also explained that men were afraid of losing their jobs, and therefore most men with families and responsibilities veered away from visible demonstrations and active participation. Virginia shared her story about a conversation that she had with her husband regarding her activism. Her husband told her that one of his white colleagues had saw her picketing and had asked if that was his wife. So her husband responded by saying, "Yes, that is my wife." The white colleague said, and I quote, "We don't let our women do that," end quote. Her husband responded, and I quote, "Well, I give you permission to go and stop mine," end quote. That story serves as an example that no one could actually stop these women from being active participants in the movement because they had freedom on their mind, right? And then this is the last story that I want to share about these African-American women activists. It also comes from the 2002 recorded interviews at SUNO. And it's a story of Sandra Nixon. And Sandra Nixon told the story about being carried out of the New Orleans City Hall, and that's her being carried out for trying to integrate the cafeteria. In 1961, as a freshman at SUNO, she recalled meeting Aretha Castle Haley. And she described Aretha Castle as a socially and racially conscious person. And according to Sandra, Aretha actually recruited her to join the movement and become a member of CORE. And after being invited, she did so, and she became a very active member. So Sandra recalls what she said was a true story behind the iconic picture of the New Orleans movement in which Reverend Alexandra, shown here, was dragged out of City Hall. She said Reverend Alexandra was sparked to action by two young ladies, including herself and Doris Jean Castle, Aretha's younger sister. According to Sandra, she and Doris had went to integrate the cafeteria at City Hall, and they sat down at one of the tables to be served and were immediately asked by the police to leave. Sandra and Doris refused to leave. They refused to get out of their chairs, and they were carried out of City Hall in their chairs. And the police officer, and then Reverend Alexandra saw what was happening. So he decided that he was not going to leave also that he sat down and yeah, so he sat down and he refused to move as well. The police couldn't pick him up. So as Sandra explained, and I quote, He was a big man, end quote. She said Doris and her were both 95 pounds, so it was easy to just carry them out in their chairs. But Reverend Alexandra was dragged out of City Hall, again, shown in this picture right here. So Sandra said she liked to tell that story publicly because she wanted everyone to know that it was two women that sparked this off first. And she said that her and Doris never actually received credit for doing this. And again, such is the story of many women activists. They really never, get a lot of credit for paving the way of equality. Instead, they are known as the women behind the movement. However, we now know with these personal accounts that they were very active, and for a lot of them, they were the women in front of the movement and the men were behind. So I like to say the history of the civil rights movement in New Orleans is multifaceted. I mean, here is a picture of the protest in front of City Hall in 1963. The entire African-American community, core members, SNCC members, it didn't matter what organization you were in, you came out and you supported the cause to end segregation throughout New Orleans. And then, after the 1965 Voting Rights Act, we did see that things changed a little bit, but not so much, right? And so the movement actually continued on all the way through the 70s. There were, different things that the African-American community had to overcome. And it's actually not until 1978 that New Orleans elects its first Black mayor, Mayor Morial. And he's mayor from 1978 to 1986. But again, like I said, the movement and everything else continued on through the 60s and even into the 70s, right? And so here we have a picture of some of the core members singing and boycotting outside of City Hall. And here is a chronology of some of the events that I mentioned in the presentation. So that's all I have for you. So if you guys have any questions.
Yeah, we have time for a couple of questions. If any, I know that one was written in the chat box, was asked by Alan Raphael. You mentioned Virginia Collins' parents, and what did they do? I mean, what was their profession? I believe he's asking about.
So Virginia Collins' parents, I'm not certain what their professions were, but they were Garveyites, which means, I don't know if you guys are familiar with Marcus Garvey. Yeah, they were Garveyites, which means that they understood from the 1930s when Marcus Garvey was there and he had the Pan-African movement and whatever to stand up for your rights. And so she was taught that from her parents, right? So it was a legacy that was given from her parents and presented on her. So that's why she became extremely active in this movement in any way that she could. And she took all 10 of her kids with her to picket.
Perfect. That's exactly what he was asking about. So thank you so much. Let me see if we have any other questions. If not, we're going to, that was an amazing talk. Thank you so much. I learned absolutely a ton from there. And thank you, Charlene. That was really good. So if we don't have any questions, we're gonna move on to Dave Thomas, and we're going to go on to the next talk.